carrying on talking about this study in Nature magazine, looking at called polygenic and developmental profiles of autism differ by age of diagnosis. It's getting dark. I should really put the light on in a minute. Right, just about see. Can't be up. Yeah, I just can't be asked to go up. So, behavioural trajectories in diagnosis age. So, the study used carer-reported strengths and difficulties questionnaire, known as the SDQ. So, the first trajectory identified is characterised by difficulties in early childhood that remain stable or even modestly attenuated in adolescence. In fact, this has been called the early childhood emergent trajectory. So, obvious traits of autism in early life that remain relatively stable through development and might possibly actually weaken or improve a bit in adolescence. But the key is that the person has obvious traits in early life that can remain relatively stable, so they're not kind of going to get markedly worse across development. The second trajectory has fewer difficulties in early childhood, but they increase in late childhood and adolescence. So this is known as the late childhood emergent trajectory, where the symptoms become more obvious in late childhood and adolescence, where they might get a lot worse, and the person then gets diagnosed autistic because maybe in earlier life these traits were not quite as pronounced. So this is like one where the person essentially gets worse over time. Autistic individuals, and that's known as the late childhood emergent trajectory. Autistic individuals in the early childhood trajectory are more likely to be diagnosed in childhood, and they obtained consistent results when restricting the analyses to only males, indicating the results are not driven by sex differences in the age of diagnosis. So the age of autism diagnosis is heritable, says the study. The unitary model, that's the traditional model, assumes that later diagnosis reflects subtle or less severe clinical features. A prediction of the unitary model is that earlier diagnosis is associated with a greater polygenic propensity for autism compared with the later diagnosis. But the evidence now supports the existence of different genetic architectures across diagnostic age groups, which aligns with the developmental model. So the suggestion is that there are two autism polygenic factors. These findings indicate that the age of diagnosis reflects a mixture of different age-dependent polygenic traits, the developmental model, rather than a single polygenic trait, the unitary model. So I guess, we're moving away from that one-dimensional idea of autism, that you move from more mild to severe, and instead based upon like a genetic load, and instead looking at a kind of multi-dimensional model of different autisms that are only modestly correlated with one another, that share different genetic architectures. It's not a case of someone having more of these genes or less of these genes, or more severe autism and mild autism. The idea being that there are different genetic architecture, there are different groups. Early and later diagnosis autism have different polygenic etiologies. So the study looks at genetic correlations of autism factors. Because later diagnosed autistic individuals have higher rates of mental health conditions, they propose that this might partly be because earlier and later diagnosed autism factors have differing genetic correlations with mental health and cognitive phenotypes. I do wonder, though, to what extent the lack of support in an earlier diagnosis might be part of the picture. They did mention that as well, by the way, but I think they still found this correlation with different genes, implying that it's not just to do with that. But again, this is very broad brush averages. A higher genetic correlation between later diagnosed autism and other mental health conditions may indicate, however, this might indicate diagnostic misclassification, in which individuals with other conditions that incorrectly receive an autism diagnosis, possibly, or diagnostic overshadowing, where the presence of co-occurring mental health conditions can delay an autism diagnosis. In a unitary model, genetics of later diagnosed autism would reflect the additive genetic effects of earlier diagnosed autism and mental health conditions, but the new evidence has shown that later diagnosed autism cannot be entirely attributed to polygenic effects of earlier diagnosed autism and mental health conditions tested. So later diagnosed autism genetic factor does not represent the additive genetic effects of earlier diagnosed autism and mental health conditions on top. The results instead indicate that earlier and later diagnosed autism are associated with different developmental trajectories and are only moderately genetically correlated with each other. The genetic correlation between autism and ADHD increases with later age and autism diagnosis. That's interesting. But it's important to note, however, they do also mention that it's important to note that access to healthcare and stigma probably does have an effect on who receives the diagnosis and when. So that's kind of like confounding factors, which adds a bit of noise to get data. I'm not sure to what extent this genetic study really separates out that noise, because they need to replicate this. Developmental and polygenic differences represent a gradient rather than being discrete categories, and there is no consensus on age thresholds for early or late diagnosis. Yeah, exactly. So when some people might say an early diagnosis is like, say, 1 to 6 years old, maybe, early diagnosis. But others might say that early diagnosis, say, could go up to maybe 13 years or something. So there are kind of differing ideas as to what constitutes an early versus late diagnosis. And it's a gradient rather than being discrete categories. So there's going to be lots of people who are in the kind of like middle ground who don't fit into either one of these categories. You know, it's not a kind of simple case of like, it's not a simple case of there being two types of autism that you can say this is one type because they got an early diagnosis, this is another. It's more complicated than that. It's just to do with very broad brush averages, and it's a gradient. So it's kind of a matter of degree. It's not a case of someone being firmly in one group or the other. And also they say that this is just a start. There are going to be many more subgroups in this. This is just a start. A bit like that other study I mentioned, looking at this proposal of 4 subtypes, you know, about social behavioural difficulties, mixed autism, moderately affected, etc. That study I talked about, again, says, you know, this is only a start. There's going to be many more subtypes in that. The average genetic profile... those with diagnosed later were more likely to experience social difficulties during adolescence and increased mental health problems in adolescence. Children diagnosed autistic early in life, before age 6, were more likely to show behavioural difficulties, social interaction problems, etc. from early childhood. And the average genetic profile of later diagnosed autism is closer to that of ADHD, as well as to mental health conditions, than it is to autism diagnosed in early childhood. And some of these children may have features that were not picked up by parents until they cause distress in late childhood and teens. Okay, so that's the study. Do let me know what you think. I've got many questions to ask about this. Many questions. I mean, I was diagnosed late. I was diagnosed age 21. However, there were very obvious concerns about my development in early childhood. In actual fact, from about the age of 18 months, well, the health visitor, my mum told me, actually said I was impaired. Part of the test, you know, like when they do a health check at about the age of 18 months, said, at least on part of the test, that I was impaired, because I couldn't do some of the things that were expected at that age. And nursery school were concerned. As soon as I started school, they were concerned. So there were clearly kind of obvious things going on from quite early in my life. So I wasn't one of those ones in this study where the problems become only apparent in late childhood. I had pretty significant challenges from toddlerhood, I would say. But I was happy. I didn't have any mental health problems at that age. I was a happy, healthy child. That's part of the reason why, by the way, why my mum didn't actually really do anything about it, because although she was very concerned and she put it down to other things like her own stress. But because I was very healthy, I was very happy, I was very robust, I giggled a lot, you know, clearly physically very healthy and happy. Yeah, she put it down to other things, but there were. That's actually funny enough when she said she actually had the back of her mind for autism for quite some time, but because I was alert and healthy and happy, I think she just kind of put it to the back of her mind. Thought, well, I'll just wait until school does something about it. And the school were concerned about me from very early on, but again, it was all like blaming my parents really, like, oh, you need to interact more with the other parents at the school gate, you know, go to early learning centre, get books. But they were concerned about me, and in actual fact, I had more obvious autistic problems, funnily enough, in childhood than I did in adolescence. But what did change was that in adolescence, some of those autistic problems, social problems, I suppose, actually gave. I mean, they were still there, like very pronounced, but they kind of. I guess the only difference is that I kind of got better at kind of masking them from about the age of 13. Not very successfully, but to outsiders, maybe they might have seen me as appearing more like normal after that age. And I think when I was a child, I think it's a bit like that person my dad saw at the cafe. Said she always assumed I was autistic because she knew me as a child. Because back when I was a kid, I didn't mask at all, and I think I was pretty obvious in presentation. It's just so I actually think I really should have been diagnosed a lot younger, but I was one of those outliers who was just missed because of bad luck, essentially. So I do wonder what genetic group I'm in, but then I do have mental health problems. So I don't have depression. I don't have any of the ones listed. I have OCD. So yeah, so I might be one of those kind of borderline cases who's kind of like in a little bit of both of those groups, maybe. Like I'm not clearly in one or the other. Yeah, so I'm like thinking, I want to know what group I'm in. That would be quite interesting, but yeah, I don't know what group I'd fall in. Diagnosed late, but at the same time, I was picked up early, if that makes sense, because I was assessed by school when I was 9. That wasn't an autism diagnosis at that age. That was just an educational psychology assessment. But yeah, I was given a diagnosis of other things, sort of like learning and stuff. But for various reasons, the autism itself wasn't diagnosed till I was an adult. And it makes me wonder about those other cases like that who were diagnosed with other things when they were younger, but didn't get an autism diagnosis until they were later. Even though they were actually very obvious and should have got diagnosed when they were younger because it was screaming. It wasn't like, basically I wasn't one of those ones who was hiding in plain sight. It was flagrant when I was a kid. That's why that person my dad met said she always assumed I was. It was very obvious, but like now it isn't. Not to like someone who doesn't know about autism, because I've changed. From about the age of 13, someone who doesn't know I'm autistic, after about that age, well, I don't actually know because I think I was still quite obvious at the age of 13, but I think from about late teens onwards, I think I had learnt to kind of cover it up enough for people who don't know about autism, because I could put on a front now, so I can come across as like, I could put on a front like my enacted, copy to kind of perfection. I could put on quite a good act for a short period of time. Like when I speak to someone on the phone, I could just imitate my dad basically, and I could sound very refined and she could talk pretty well, you know. It's all an act. But yeah, I think someone who doesn't know anything about autism now probably wouldn't necessarily know. But back when I was a kid, it was obvious. So I do wonder what group I was in. That would be quite interesting. Anyway, do let me know what you think about this video, and thank you for watching.